That alone, verse number 8. Turning in and tuning on, enjoying the five fruits such as beauty, mounted on a foul-smelling gun, and evasively flying back and forth, are five birds. Having brought them down through an inversion, that radiant inner awareness should fill one's entire being. Commentary. The first 10 verses mark the introduction to the 100 verses of self-instruction. Among these verses, 8 is of crucial importance. In it, an ontological assessment is made with a teleological goal. Metaphysics comes to grips with aesthetics and ethics. Further, this verse exemplifies the structural plan of the work as a whole. The reader with a careful eye can see the circulation of libidinal energy, which explains many secrets of human woe and happiness. There are also several paradoxes to resolve, which we will examine one by one. First of all, let us get a picture of the structure of the allegoric gestalt of this verse. The metaphor is of a tree, with birds hovering around its branches and a hunter standing beneath it. The fruits above and the hunter below mark a vertical parameter. The tree has 5 kinds of fruit, symbolizing the objects of the 5 sense interests. The birds are said to be flying back and forth, evasively, enjoying the sensuous fruits. The range of their movement should be understood as a horizontal parameter within which life urges become actualized at an ontological level. The Guru is using a mixed metaphor, alternating the tree with a foul-smelling gun, evocative of the alimentary canal. As we go into the details of this metaphor, we should notice some of the glaring paradoxes which are placed side by side. A tree symbolizes life, growth, and fruition. On the other hand, a gun is a symbol of fate, uncertainty, and destruction. Both of these aspects are merged by the literary device of depicting their outlines as vaguely as possible. The person standing beneath the tree is the enjoyer, and the 5 evasive birds are none other than his or her own sense interests. This person is required to act with hostility towards the intention of the sense appetites. Thus, 2 contrary intentions are bracketed by the implied relationship between the person beneath the tree and the birds playing hide and seek in the branches. It would seem that the annihilation of one's senses would spell great disaster, plunging one into a grievous darkness. Instead, it is pointed out that one becomes filled with a great light by striking down the 5 birds. So this metaphor has in it 6 factors to reckon with: the birds and fruits, the tree and gun, and destruction and illumination. In this verse, Narayana Guru lays the groundwork for both the aesthetics and the ethics he wants to develop in the rest of the book. Aesthetics will be considered first in the Kantian sense, and then in the context of the historical transformation that the concept has undergone. Our knowledge has 2 aspects. We arrive at one through intuition. The other is what we experience as our sensibility. In a number of cases, these 2 aspects go hand in hand. When intention aids us in deciphering the meaning of a sensation, we arrive at an empirical notion. Our common experience is to put sensation on the side of what is generally looked upon as matter, the realm where names and forms are important. Intuition, on the other hand, is taken as a natural device of operational efficiency with which the mind structures the logical relevancy of the connectedness between things and ideas within the matrix of cause and effect and other relation-relata complexes. According to Kant, there are a priori principles governing both intuition and sensation. In fact, he even calls the pure form of sensibility pure intuition. He says, quotation, "Thus, if I take away from our representation of a body all that the understanding thinks as belonging to it, as substance, force, divisibility, etc., and also whatever belongs to sensation as impenetrability, hardness, color, etc., yet there is still something left us from this empirical intuition, namely extension and shape. These belong to pure intuition, which exists a priori in the mind as a mere form of sensibility and without any real object of the senses or any sensation. The science of all the principles and sensibility a priori I call transcendental aesthetic. There must then be such a science forming the first part of the transcendental doctrine of elements, in contradistinction to that part which contains the principles of pure thought and which is called transcendental logic. In the science of transcendental aesthetics, accordingly, we shall first isolate sensibility or the sensuous faculty by separating from it all that is annexed to its perceptions by the conceptions of understanding, so that nothing be left but empirical intuition." End of quote. It is important to understand the fundamental nature of sensuous knowledge, as Kant explained it in his Critique of Pure Reason. It comes very close to the unique role that a person's subjectivity plays in their appreciation of an empirical experience. Quotation, "In order to prevent any misunderstanding, it will be requisite, in the first place, to recapitulate as clearly as possible what our opinion is with respect to the fundamental nature of our sensuous cogitation in general. We have intended then to say that all our intuition is nothing but the representation of phenomena, that the things which we intuit are not in themselves so constituted as they appear to us, and that if we take away the subject, or even only the subjective constitution of our senses in general, then not only the nature and relations of objects in space and time, but even space and time themselves disappear, and that these as phenomena cannot exist in themselves, but only in us. What may be the nature of objects considered as things in themselves, and without reference to the receptivity of our sensibility, is quite unknown to us. We know nothing more than our own mode of perceiving them, which is peculiar to us, and which, though not of necessity pertaining to every animated being, is so to the whole human race. With this alone we have to do. Space and time are thus the pure forms thereof, sensation the matter. The former alone can we recognize a priori, that is, antecedent to all actual perception, and for this reason such cogitation is called pure intuition. The latter is that in our cognition, which is called cognition a posteriori, that is empirical intuition, the former appertain absolutely and necessarily to our sensibility of whatsoever kind our sensations may be. The latter may be of very diversified character. Supposing that we should carry our empirical intuition even to the very highest degree of clearness, we should not thereby advance one step nearer to a knowledge of the constitution of objects as things in themselves, for we could only at best arrive at a complete cognition of our own mode of intuition, that is, of our sensibility, and this always under the conditions originally attaching to the subject, namely the conditions of space and time, while the question, what are objects considered as things in themselves, remains unanswerable even after the most thorough examination of the phenomenal world. That is the end of a quotation by Kant. In the first line of verse 8, Oli Mudalam Palamanjam and Und should be carefully examined to understand their aesthetic interconnectedness. Oli means light, with an affective quality. It does not stand by itself as an abstraction. It immediately suggests its counterpart, the eye, that is attracted by the light. The word mudalam implies the initiation of the chain of events that are imperative whenever the attraction of light is registered in an appreciating eye. It is followed by the suggestion param, an edible fruit. The allegorical force engendered by putting the images of the attracting light and the edible fruit side by side, subjectively, creates a pleasurable situation through the complementary interaction of the two images. Even at the word level of suggestion, the Kantian intuition of transcendental aesthetics, the a priori, is maintained. Thus, in this verse, a psychological phenomena comes on the heels of an ontological urge and is followed by its own pattern, which is typical of each person concerned. The subtle nuance of the suggestion is so forceful that one wants to hide from oneself on hearing these words, because the hint given by them recalls to one's mind many anecdotal memories one might well want to bury or forget. Then, like the bang of a rifle shot, comes the reminder of death. From an attitude of playfulness, one is abruptly called to consider the serious eventuality of death. This is like suddenly calling the attention of a clown who is doing pranks in a circus arena to the grim reality of the gas chamber. Even when a person is indulging in the trivialities of life with an outward show of gaiety, he is often reminded of the possibility of tragedy that may be encountered at any moment. This is a peculiar context, but so very common in life. Two imperatives come from opposite sides, as it were, and both claim the pursuance of their path by the ego consciousness, which is caught between the conclusive compulsions of incipient memories and the moral dictates of a volition that cannot be superseded without aggravating the tragedy of one's placement in a consequential chain of events. One says enjoy, the other says withdraw. It is a perennial dilemma. Some of the deeper aspects of the problem, which is presented in a muted form in this verse, will be further explicated in verses 69 and 70. In verse 69, the organs of perception, such as hearing, are compared to horses that are yoked to a chariot of libido. The ego which rides in it is described as a shadow of the self, which is always drawn towards objects of pleasure. Irresistibly, the chariot is driven in pursuit of these ephemeral items of interest. In verse 70, the same libido is presented as a phenomenon of magical potency that unfolds itself as the inner organ, the senses, and the body, and its very many hedonistic urges. We should bear these descriptions in mind when we think of the 5 birds who are enjoying fruits such as visual beauty. The movements of the birds is qualified as nayena, evasive. The word naya has several shades of meaning. The tactics of a diplomat are called naya. The implication is that in outward form one seems to be upholding ethical norms and correct behavior, while at heart one is maneuvering with conceit. The defense mechanism of concupiscence is naya. In the Holy Quran, one can find hundreds of passages decrying this kind of conceit. For a spiritual or moral life, one is asked to be straightforward and simple. The Freudian concept of the clash between the id and the superego, being reflected in the neurotic behavior of the ego, can be used to more fully understand the connotations of the term naya. The operation of the moral authority of the superego is a kind of mirroring within oneself of a false image of public expectations. One then tries to conform to the requirements of that pattern with continuous deliberation, while at the same time indulging in a secretive enjoyment of forbidden pleasures, privately painting them with altruistic motives to look as bright and acceptable as possible. The ethical considerations of trying to please both oneself and the public are as enigmatic as the Sphinx. The kind of morality upheld by this kind of attitude is what Henri Bergson describes as closed and static. It is opposed to the morality of an absolutist, which is both open and dynamic. In The Devil's Disciple, George Bernard Shaw tries to show the distinction between these two kinds of morality. The dharma that Narayana Guru once adopted is what the Ishavasya Upanishad describes as the ethics of a truthful person, Satya Dharma. The final instruction given in this verse is to subvert one's interest in the gratification of desires, which was exemplified in the first 2 lines of the verse by the tactical enjoyment of the fruits by the 5 birds or sense interests. The straight literal meaning of Kil Marikam is bringing down. There is also an implied sense of inverting the situation. This can be better understood in the light of the Freudian concepts of the topography of the unconscious, preconscious, and conscious factors, and the movement of psychic energy either horizontally or vertically. In the present context, the Freudian id is to be taken as the incipient memories, which have within them the potencies of karma in various stages of maturation. Although Freud speaks of the topology of consciousness, the situation is so mobile that the landscape is constantly fluctuating. There are 2 kinds of energy spoken of here, which have a mutual affinity. One is the light that is revealing the presence of an object of enjoyment, which is recognized by behaviorists as a stimulus affecting the receptors. The other is a quantum of energy, which Freud recognized as a libidinal cathexis, coming from the depths of the individual's unconscious and flowing towards the source of physical stimulation. To understand this a bit better, let us take the example of a certain variety of sesame seed grown in South India. Usually it is sown in February and blossoms in April. If by mistake the same type of seed is sown in May, you still have to wait until April of the next year for it to blossom. So it is not merely the physical environment that makes the seed unfold its characteristics. It has within it a genetic encoding of its program. Similarly, each incipient memory has its own inner rhythm of releasing its libidinal energy. In this process, every instance of experiential encounter with an object of interest results in the diffusion of energy. When energy is taken from one area, it naturally loses that much energy. Understood in this sense, the overt enjoyment of pleasures is a continuous process of the exhaustion of one's reserve of psychical energy. So there is a paradoxical element of self-destruction involved. In certain cases, the expression of libidinal energy circulates inwardly rather than being directed toward an external object. Freud had occasion to notice this only in some pathological cases where a person was indulging in autoeroticism. Freud here confuses the body and the self, a common misunderstanding. But limiting pleasure to autoeroticism is still directing the energy to an objective expression and not to the core of oneself. Thus, his was only a partial view. What Narayana Guru recommends here is a healthy way of turning one's energy inward, conserving and directing energy by concentering all interests within one's own self. This brings about a process of sublimation, which unfortunately has not been explored very much by psychologists. Alfred Adler, who had an intimation of this depth, tried to pinpoint it by examining the insights of Dostoevsky, who he quotes as saying, "I have a mad love of penetrating to the limits of the real, there where the fantastic begins." Adler continues, quotation, "His attacks he describes as making him feel as though an intoxication of joy enticed him to the farthermost limits of the sensation of living, where he felt himself near God, so near indeed that only one step would have sufficed to cut him off from life. This picture recurs again and again in all his heroes and has a profound significance." End of quote. Going to this depth can be either pathological, bordering on the symptoms of epilepsy, or it can be one of the highest forms of spiritual absorption, so powerful as to make one's body tremble when external consciousness is withdrawn into such a profound sense of inward ecstasy. Once, when Sri Ramakrishna casually viewed the flight of some white herons against the background of a dark cloud, the beauty of the birds gliding in harmony was so telling that he entered into an ecstatic spiritual absorption. In such an experience, the energy is not going outward to the object. Rather, it is received into the vortex of the soul or psyche in an inversion of the energy flow. Instead of a sensuous experience triggered by an external stimulus, the entire psychic field spirals centripetally to the core of one's deepest consciousness. One experiences both the inside and the outside as a continuous whole of the same blissful self. Dhan Gopal Mukherjee, in The Face of Silence, speaks of another such experience of Sri Ramakrishna. Quotation, "Wherever Ramakrishna looked, he saw light, light, light. I have found you, I have found you," crying, he dashed out of the temple. Wherever he went, he saw nothing but light. The Ganges curved at his feet like a sickle of gold. The shore on which he stood was but a rock of solid flame. The trees in the distance, the boats and their boatsmen in the middle of the river, the birds coursing through the sky, and the very sky itself sang, possessed of the divine light. I have found you, he cried with the rishis of old. Hearken unto me, ye sons of immortality. I have found him, the Person Supreme. Even the gods, those dwellers in the highest spaces, are humbled now that I have found him, the sun-clad one. End of quote. Although in these words of Dhangopal Mukherjee's there is a poetic exaggeration of the seer's inner sense of wonder, it is nonetheless a portrayal of the true experience of the spiritual inversion which Narayana Guru wants us to understand. Between the object of interest and the pleasurable experience of the self, there is a numerator-denominator relationship. The object of interest is the numerator, and the ego-oriented self which seeks gratification is hiding in the unconscious as the denominator. When the situation is inverted with the envisioning of the Supreme Self as the occasion of all happiness, the self is pushed into the forefront as the numerator. The object that was initially instrumental in verticalizing the self, its awareness and its blissful nature into a unitive whole, effaces its individuality and goes into the denominator as the existence that precedes the essence. And the free translation of verse number 8 is as follows. The body is like a foul-smelling gun. In it reside one's senses, which are like 5 birds always looking for the opportunity to feed on chance gains. With right understanding and discernment, one should break away from their enchantment and should resolutely aspire to the good instead of being ensnared by the pleasurable. Then alone will one's inside be filled with the radiance of the unsurpassed bliss of the Absolute, which will foil all distractions generated by sensual attraction.